So welcome everyone to the UK Polish History Panel. Before we introduce our absolutely amazing panellists, I would like to welcome the UK Ambassador to Poland, Anna Clunes, to say a few words. Welcome, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Oh, sorry, this is the first time I've done a Teams in, it's that one, got it, right. Sorry, I've got two screens here. Very nice to meet you, Alina.
That's fine, not a problem. Welcome.
So I thank you very much for inviting me to say a few words at the beginning. Today, this is my first official event as British Ambassador to Poland. I today at lunchtime presented my letters of credential to President Duda and talked to him about the important relationship between our two countries. And I just wanted to say two things that happened to me and just share them with those who are online. The first one is that, I talked to the president about the fact that, today is obviously an incredibly historic day, and that the Prime Minister of the UK had laid a wreath at the monument to Polish pilots who had taken part in the Battle of Britain, and I guess that was a good symbol of the very close alliance between Poland and the United Kingdom. We then, of course, went on to talk about the many things that connect the two countries and our sort of shared determination to make the relationship even stronger in the years ahead. But I thought that was as with Poland, there is always a historical thing that you should talk about. And then the second thing that I wanted to pass on was that as part of the credential ceremony, I was very privileged today to lay a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier. And I'm sure many of our panelists will know all about the history of that, of the tomb of the unknown soldier, and the fact it was part of a palace that was destroyed during the Second World War. But I just again wanted to pass on that again in a very historical way, as I stood there and listened to the trumpet, remembering the history between our two countries, the military relationship, and the many people who have fought so bravely to preserve democracy and freedom around the world. So two very important parts of my ceremony today. And I'm really delighted to meet, even if virtually, some of our panelists. I'm a fan. I've been preparing for this posting by reading about Polish history. I still have a few books to go, but I'm hoping to find out more during the course of this discussion. And I also just wanted to say a huge thank you to the Chevening Alumni Association for working with the embassy on it. I understand we are now into our 25th year of Chevening, which is a huge source of pride to us, and you all matter incredibly much. I hope that some of you are online today. So I'm very interested to hear from the panelists. I will mute myself out in a minute, but I just wanted to wish the whole of this event very good fortune, and I'm looking forward to enjoying it. Now, over to you, Alina.
Ambassador, I just want to say thank you very much for your opening remarks, and also on behalf of myself and our panelists, I'd love to congratulate you on presenting your credentials to the Polish President this afternoon. Welcome to Poland, and we're really excited to have you. So good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank you for joining us today for the UK Polish History Panel on the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Britain. I'd also like to thank the British Embassy for hosting this event, and Chevening for sponsoring this event. And not to forget the British Alumni Society for spreading the word to their alumni network. Welcome, everyone. We have four absolutely incredible panelists joining us today to talk about Polish-British historic relations since the Second World War. So let me introduce to you our first panelist, who is Przemyslaw Biskup. He is an analyst for the European Union programme at the Polish Institute for International Affairs. Just a note, PISM is a state non-partisan entity funded by the Parliament and based on the Act of Parliament. His research focuses on European and domestic policies of Great Britain and Ireland, including Brexit. Our second panelist is Professor Pavel Machtevich. He is a professor at the Institute of Political Studies of the Polish Academy of Sciences in Warsaw. He is also the founding director of the incredible Museum of the Second World War in Gdańsk. He has written some fantastic books like Rebellious Satellite, Poland 1956, and Poland's War on Radio Free Europe, 1950 to 1989. Our third panelist is Roger Moorhouse. He is a historian and an author specializing in Nazi Germany, Poland, and World War II Europe. He has written many books on the subject, including The Devil's Alliance, Hitler's Pact with Stalin, and most recently, First to Fight, the Polish War 1939, for which he recently received the Cavalier's Cross of the Order of Merit of the Republic of Poland. Congratulations, Roger. Our fourth and final panelist is Clare Mulley, who is an award-winning author and broadcaster. You may recognize her from many historical documentaries. She has also written some fantastic books like The Woman Who Saved the Children and The Spy Who Loved, a book about the World War II spy Christina Scarbeck, also known as Christine Grenville, which led to her being decorated with the Polish Bene Merito honorary distinction. So before we begin our questions, I would like to remind you to please keep your video and your microphone muted for the duration of the event. There will be a Q&A at the end, so please save your questions until then. Please write them in the chat box, and please put your name in before you type your question so our panelists know who they're speaking with. The event will last for 1.5 hours and should end about 16:30 UK time and 17:30 Polish time. Those who would like to stay longer at the end for additional questions are free to do so. So welcome to our amazing panelists. Hello.
Hello.
Hello, Alina.
I think we should get started with some questions, don't you?
Absolutely.
So I think we're going to start with Przemyslaw. Przemyslaw, you are our first person. Can you please set the scene for us with Polish-Britain relationships before the Second World War, and was there much migration between the two nations at the time?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think it has to be realized that despite the fact that during the Second World War and after the Second World War, we had major waves of migration, mostly I would say forced, obviously during the war forced, but then also still somehow forced political migration. There hasn't been much of the interaction on this field between Poland and Britain in preceding times. Obviously, we can always find some glorious counter examples, like, for example, Joseph Conrad, or Józef Konrad Korzeniowski, or Edmund Paweł Strzelecki, one of the explorers of Australia. But it has to be realized that the Second World War was absolutely formative in the sense that that was the first historical moment when we, as a result, we got a very substantial Polish community on the British Isles, and that community has never disappeared. And it has been renewed on a regular basis after the Second World War, especially 1960s and in 1980s, and for the last time since 2004. Thank you.
Sorry, that's me having technical difficulties because my microphone just doesn't want to unmute itself. I do apologise to everybody, including Przemyslaw. We all might as well have a bit of a laugh about that. Thank you very much. That was. Would anybody have anything to add to that off our panel? No? Okay. So we'll move on to the next question, which is for Roger Moorhouse. Can you tell us what were the British-Polish relations like on the eve of World War II, and how did the first years of the war shape those relations?
Hello, Alina. Hello, everyone. It's an interesting question. I think, as we just heard, that British-Polish relations prior to that point are sort of rather normal, in that sense that there's nothing particularly special going on. There's a few high-profile individuals, but nothing much more than that. And obviously, there's a step change in 39, and primarily with the British guarantee to Poland in March of 1939, and then with the Anglo-Polish military agreement of August 1939. So that's a real step change. For the first time, Poland is a sort of frontline ally of Britain in that sense. But again, even bearing all of that in mind, I think the question of what British-Polish relations were like is largely a question of perspective, because from a Polish perspective, in that perilous summer of 1939, it was crucial for Poland to have foreign allies. They fully appreciated they couldn't defeat the Germans alone, or even the Soviets alone. They needed foreign allies to assist them to even be able to put up a square fight. And they thought they'd achieved that in that August of 1939. And this is why you see those crowds on the streets of Warsaw and elsewhere on the 3rd of September, cheering Britain to the rafters and holding banners saying, long live Britain, and so on. So from Polish perspective, this appeared temporarily something like a salvation that this British alliance, the British relationship had been forged. But from a British perspective, it's slightly different. From a British perspective, it's a much less, I think, significant arrangement that's been made in September. I think this is often portrayed particularly in Polish circles, this is often portrayed as sort of somehow Machiavellian in its origins, that the British are sort of cynically almost goading the Poles to fight, and then in the hope that Britain will be the last to be eaten by the totalitarian powers. I don't really accept that. I don't see much evidence of Machiavellian thinking in British sort of cabinet meetings and official papers of the period. There's a lot of talk about meeting their treaty obligations, and a lot of praise for Poland. There's a lot of public affection for Poland and public sympathy for Poland. But that relationship from a British perspective was rather more, trying to draw a line in the sand. It was really an attempt to sort of hem Hitler in some way, in the hope that merely by expressing the threat of war, Hitler would be dissuaded from further aggression. And when that didn't transpire as London expected it to, there was no plan B, effectively. So, and it seems for all the world that those promises made by the British appear to be very empty, which in fact they were, because not much was done in Poland's defence. So again, it's very much a question of perspective. If you look at September 39, at least, from whichever way you're looking, from the Polish perspective, it was very significant. From the British perspective, I think slightly less. The first years of the war obviously shaped that relationship in very important ways, because first France and then Britain becomes a haven for those Polish fighters and others, politicians as well, trying to escaping Poland. This is where after Paris and Angers, London is where the Polish government in exile ends up. And you get large numbers of troops fighting alongside British and in British colours going forward, not least 303 during the Battle of Britain, to timely date on which to mention their contribution, which is very significant. So it becomes much more significant in the first years of the war, not least because of those large numbers of Poles fighting alongside the British. But as I said, I think in September 39, there's a question of perspective as to how significant that relationship was. Does anyone else want to come in?
Thank you.
Alina, I'm afraid you're still muted.
Can't hear you.
We still can't hear you, Alina.
Okay,
there
so
we go. Is it?
Yeah.
Sorry,
you're on now.
No, I think my laptop doesn't like me very much today. That's my fault. I do apologise. Would anybody like to add anything to what Roger said at all?
Yeah, I think it's worth adding one thing. In 1939, Poland, there was this Polish-British alliance created, and it's from the perspective of posteriority, this seems a very intuitive solution. But I think it's worth remembering that throughout the Polish way to independence in the beginning of 20th century, then during the First World War and during the whole of the interbellum, it was France which was the first and the prominent ally of Poland in the West. And in that sense, there was really nothing that unique about Polish-British relations up to that fateful spring of 1939, and that relationship has been, I would say, very, very deeply transformed. And from the Polish perspective, also, this resulted in quite substantial and durable transformation of Poland's relationship to France. Thank you.
I would agree with that, absolutely. And I think just to add a final point in trying to explain that British attitude, I think there's a degree of the attitude towards the Poles in 1939. I think there's a degree of sort of almost imperialist sort of hubris that the Poles are, this is just another power. This isn't necessarily a country that we have a close relationship with, but this is a power that is essentially can be used in that relationship. It can be used in that capacity as trying to hem Hitler in and dissuade him from his aggressive action. So I think I think that's what colours again the later on developing relationship with the Poles, is that the Poles are not necessarily taken entirely, even I think entirely seriously. I think that attitude towards 303 was quite interesting in 1990, that they were to some extent looked down on, despite their sort of combat experience that they had that no RAF pilots had. So there's a degree of sort of imperial arrogance, I think, in the British attitude.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Roger and Przemyslaw. So after the fall of France, the Polish government in exile left for London and stayed past the Second World War till the fall of communism. Pavel, could you please tell us a little about the Second World War, the Polish government in exile during the Second World War? What was the relationship like with the British government at the time?
Sure, but before I mention the Polish government in exile, I would like to follow up a little bit what Roger was saying about 1939. So, as it was mentioned, the moment when the Great Britain joined the war, it was on the 3rd of September, brought about a great wave of enthusiasm. In Poland, in Warsaw, there were demonstrations in front of the British embassy. But very soon there was a great disappointment because there was no Franco-British offensive on the Western Front. And significantly enough, the Germans tried to exploit this disillusionment, this bitterness. When you see the photographs from Warsaw, from the first weeks of the occupation, you can see posters, German posters in Polish, with a slogan, Anglio, twoje dzieło. England, you did it. And you can see ruins and a Polish wounded soldier. And so it was a suggestion that the Great Britain pushed Poland towards the resistance, and the consequences were tragic. And it is not so much known that the first Polish victim of the German occupation, a young woman, Elżbieta Zachorska, was the one who teared down this poster already in early October, and she was executed by the Germans, probably the first victim of the German occupation. So there was a lot of disappointment on the Polish side. After the fall of France in June 1940, the Polish government in exile evacuated to London along the Polish troops. and for a certain period of time, the Polish government in exile was the main ally of Britain. And the Polish troops were the main allied armed forces fighting along the British army. This is a very well-known story of Polish pilots, but perhaps less known story about the Polish intelligence that provided the Brits very valuable information as early as in 1940-41, for example, about the German intention to move troops to Northern Africa in early 41. So this situation of a privileged alliance between Polish government in exile and the British government, it continued until June 41, when Germany attacked the Soviet Union, and then it abruptly changed because the Soviet Union became the most strategic, the most important ally of Great Britain, and the British pushed the Polish government in exile to seek the agreement with the Soviet government. It was signed in summer 41, but there was also another story. The British government wanted the Polish government in exile to accept conceding the Polish eastern territories to the Soviet Union. And Churchill explained to the Poles that Great Britain guaranteed the Polish independence in 39, but not the Polish border. So it was a very contentious issue between the Polish government in exile and the British government. And it all led to the Tehran conference at the end of 43, when Churchill and Roosevelt agreed to concede half of Poland to Stalin. And by the way, the Polish government in exile was not notified about it. It learned only a year later. So it was a very mixed relationship. At first, one can say that a privileged relationship, and then the raison d'etat, the British interests, somehow were different than the Polish interests, and it led to a very bitter situation for the Poles. I think that we'll discuss it later. We will mention probably the Yalta conference, but at the end of the war, there was not so much left from this very close alliance from the first 2 years of the war.
Claire, you have something to add?
I mean, that's absolutely right, and very interesting. And we sort of raced through the war quite a bit now. I mean, just because initially we were looking at those early years, and you're right, that was a very different relationship to later on it became the big three. But in those early years, I mean, there was the starts, there was the hopes of a little more, and it was disappointing more didn't happen. But for example, I look particularly at the special forces and special operations, and there was a British mission to Poland in 1939, led by the extraordinary Sir Adrian Canton de Wiart. People might have heard of it, and he had one eye and one arm that had a hell of a head on him. And they were leading this mission with people like Colin Gubbins and Peter Wilkinson. And Gubbins later ended up heading up the British Special Operations Executive. And of course, the first person to make contact between some of the Polish resistance and the Brits was Christina Scarbeck. And we'll talk more about her later. But she was, of course, Polish and sent in by the British Special Intelligence Services. So there were just the starts of some early links there early on that became more important.
If I may, I would just add one thing, that yes, we are Claire, absolutely right, that this cooperation between the Polish intelligence and the Polish underground and the SOE was, of vital importance, but there was also politics in it that was somehow detrimental to this alliance.
That's true.
Commanders of the Home Army and the Polish government in exile were disappointed that the Brits did not provide enough weapons to the Home Army, and it was also political. They didn't want to antagonize Stalin, and for example, the Yugoslav partisans got much more deliveries than the Home Army.
This is true.
Okay. Sorry, does anybody else?
Przemyslaw? Yeah. I think actually once we discuss the importance of Polish armed forces in the West, it's good to recognize that actually they were at the very top of numerical strength. For example, Polish armed forces in the West were bigger than the Free French forces until the moment when the French provisional government could start drafting people after the day when French forces landed in France. Nonetheless, from my perspective as a person studying, for example, history of British Empire, I have the impression that the British perception quite fast, especially after 1941, changed to seeing or perceiving Polish armed forces as just one more, though big and important, part of multi-ethnic and multinational British armed forces, imperial armed forces of the Second World War. And much of the credit that should go directly to Polish soldiers in the West, because of the mechanism, has been over time given to the British side as a whole.
Any other squadron. And just in brief, I feel like because we are marking the Battle of Britain today, I have to mention some of them by name. So I wanted to just pull out a couple like Witold Urbanowicz, and I do apologise for my pronunciation, but absolutely extraordinary Polish pilot who flew first inside the British squadrons and then later joined 303. And he shot down over 15 Luftwaffe planes. And eventually he was promoted. I think he was the youngest squadron leader in the RAF. And then there were people like Antony Glavatsky, who managed to shoot down 5 planes in a single day in August in 1940. And of course, they were flying alongside the Brits. And we had French and South African and various different nationalities serving as well. Now, unfortunately, when 30 Polish pilots were killed in the battle, but this terrible cost delivered a huge result. And so I'm just going to end my little summary by quoting Hugh Dowding, the Air Chief Marshal and head of Fighter Command, who said, "Had it not been for the magnificent material contributed by the Polish squadrons and their unsurpassed gallantry, I hesitate to say that the outcome of the battle would have been the same." So you can see how significant the Polish contribution was. But I said at the beginning, I think it's really important we touch on a couple of the other points raised, and I'm sure some of the other panelists might like to come in. But one of them, I feel I need to address a rather shameful, difficult moment, which was the British Victory Parade in 1946. And this is something I've talked about a little bit. I talked about it on Newsnight at this time last year, actually, when we were talking about the Battle of Britain. Because I think there were around 200,000 Polish armed forces served under British command during the Second World War, forces that were, of course, loyal to the Polish government in exile. But by 1946, Britain had recognised the Soviet-backed or Soviet-imposed communist provisional government in Poland. And British government sent the invitation to that communist government in Poland, inviting them to join the parade. And they didn't separately invite any of the veterans and so on. Now, this did create outrage even within Britain, as well as in the Polish communities abroad and here and in Britain. I think Winston Churchill himself protested, a number of the RAF commanders did, and so on. And eventually 25 of the Polish pilots who were veterans of the Battle of Britain were invited to join the Victory Parade, along with the chiefs of the Polish Army and Polish Navy, and a couple of generals. Now, I think very understandably they declined because they felt that this invitation should have gone out more broadly. By the way, the communists also declined, so there was no representation. This year, the great irony is that this year, 2020, the Polish veterans were invited to march in the parade, as they should have done, but unfortunately it was cancelled because of COVID. So that's a terrible shame that that opportunity was lost. But there's one other point that I wanted to raise briefly as well, which was a couple of years ago, the RAF Museum in Britain decided to hold a public vote or a public survey with a vote on it to determine who was the most popular, perhaps, or I think it was named as the greatest Spitfire Mark V pilot in history. The Telegraph newspaper, national newspaper, hosted this. And with over 250,000 votes for him, the so-called, I don't want to say winner because everyone recognises this was collective effort, but the person that was pulled out was a veteran who was still with us then, Franciszek Kornicki. And everyone, all the communities celebrated that. It was a really lovely example of the recognition that is beginning to come through, or has come through, I would say, because I think 303 is really a legendary squadron now. And of course, since then, we've had 2 films, Squadron 303 and Hurricane, remembering the Polish contribution. There was a remembrance event last week by the Polish Airmen's Association in the UK. I saw Artur joining the meeting earlier. Dan Snow's just done a history hit broadcast talking specifically about the Polish contribution in the Battle of Britain today. So it is becoming part of the narrative.
Would anybody like to add anything?
Yes, I wouldn't mind just coming in briefly, if I may. I think you're absolutely right, Claire, when you say that this has become part of our British narrative of the war, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, as you'll appreciate, I sometimes feel again with British audiences trying to talk about Polish history is a bit like trying to push water uphill, because you tend to get blank looks, because there's nothing essentially for most people, ordinary people, to sort of attach the information you're giving them onto. So you're sort of building on such fragile foundations, it can be a very difficult task. But one of those aspects that ordinary people who profess an interest in World War II have in this country is they know about 303. And by the same token, I think they know now about the Polish contribution to Enigma and Ultra and so on. So that those two aspects really have gone into the British narrative of World War II, which I think is a sign of progress, because that wasn't necessarily the case 20, 30 years ago. So this is a good sign, I think.
Can I add something myself? I actually think, Roger, your book is also changing opinions and pushing things forward slowly but surely.
Thank you. No, sorry. Thank you, Alina. That's very kind.
Would anybody else like to add anything before we move on? No? Okay. So this one is about, we're going to talk about some other Polish forces. So obviously there were other Polish forces that fought alongside the British and the Western Allies. Przemyslaw, can you tell us more about their experiences? And do you think there was an understanding from the British side about the extent of Polish losses and experience, particularly having been invaded by two totalitarian powers?
No. I'm afraid the answer to the other question, to your last question, is negative, and there are a few good reasons for that. First of all, we have to remember that Poland, in the latter but decisive phase of the war, had very little of its own information and, let's say, opinion shaping or public relations machine. Certainly, it was nothing comparable to propaganda machines employed by all major powers. So it wasn't able to shape a narrative already taking shape during the latter part of the Second War, and then becoming the leading narratives until 1960s, 1970s. That's the first thing. The other thing is that when Polish efforts were recognized, they were mostly about Polish soldiers fighting frontline. So, for example, for different reasons, you would know about Polish airmen, especially 303. You would know something about Polish Navy, especially such brave and gallant ships as, for example, Piorun during the operation of sinking of Bismarck, or Błyskawica in defense of the city of Kos, town of Kos, on the Isle of Wight. You would know about Polish soldiers participating in the defense of Tobruk. However, I think the most decisive aspects, which hasn't been fully recognized up to present in popular narratives, not highly specialized professional historians' narratives, but popular narratives, are those involving intellectual input of Poland into the war effort. Enigma has been mentioned, so I won't be going into that. Probably other speakers will be happy to do that. But I would like to mention some of the inventions, quite important from point of view of soldiers, like, for example, the first electronic mine detector, or the scale of Polish intelligence. And this is such a trivial yet very, very important thing as the tank Periscope, designed already before the war by Grunblach, Polish army captain and at the same time engineer. And this design was used later on in all British tanks. And actually, in 1960s, Grundlacht, he managed to win a legal trial against the British government for royalties. And what is particularly important about those inputs, it is that they were very much classified until as late as 1970s. Let us remember that Ultra and the Ultra program and Enigma, they were classified until late 70s, not to mention the Polish input into them. So I'm afraid there is still a very, very long way to go. But I think the fact that Poland has been participating in the, I would say, the nation of free Western in the family of free Western nations since 1989 has been already reshaping those narratives. And what is probably helpful is also the fact that we have British and other troops from other countries regularly stationed in Poland, and that also helps to reinforce historical knowledge of Poland's military traditions during the Second War with our allies. Thank you.
Would anybody like to add anything? Okay,
sorry.
Oh, sorry. No, go for it.
Just quickly. I mean, two things just to add to that. The first one is, I think, from the British perspective, we have traditionally had a sort of admiration, even an obsession a little bit with the French resistance. And I think this is as much to do with our sort of closeness to the French politically and geographically, but also, this became sort of fodder for a lot of, television programs, LO, Secret Army, all that sort of thing, going back to when I was growing up. So I think that's, again, a sort of it's by these methods. It's not, unfortunately, it's not really by the methods of historians and writing books and so on, lecturing. It's often by slightly crass television programs and comedies that the popular narrative of grand events is formed. And I think this is one example. So we have the Maquis sort of loom very large in the British narrative of the war as almost an exemplar of popular resistance against the Nazis, and perversely the Polish underground doesn't until comparatively recently, and that's something that again has to change. Which needs to shift. We need to shift that focus to understand more the role of the Polish underground, the Polish government in exile. So that's one point, this sort of obsession with the French, I think, which has blotted everything out. And the other point is talking about, from your question, talking about the understanding of Poland's experience. What's interesting in this, I think, particularly in the Western narrative, is how the Soviet occupation between 39 and 41, and then to a lesser extent the reoccupation from 44 onwards of Poland, has been sort of very effectively airbrushed from the narrative, particularly from the Western narrative, and I think that's essentially down to the fact that for the second period of that I'm talking about, obviously the Soviets were our allies, so we tended to take what they said, their propaganda narrative, at face value, didn't question it. I think it's also post-war, much more importantly, the Soviet Union, of course, doesn't perish in the way that Nazi Germany does in 1945. It carries on, and it's much more effective at shaping its own narrative of World War II, which is then very effectively projected into the Western narrative. So I think that's one aspect that has traditionally been grievously missing from the Western narrative of World War II regarding Poland. And this, again, was something I tried to bring up in the last book, to actually talk about the Soviet invasion of Poland in 1939, really for the first time to actually treat it properly in a British language publication. So there's a couple of aspects there, just to sort of crystallize a bit more what Przemyslaw was saying.
Would anybody else like to add anything?
I would add one anecdote, which I think illustrates very well what Roger just described. in 2004, in the very first months of participation of Polish members of the European Parliament in the works of that body, just after EU enlargement, there were works on the commemoration of anniversary of the end of the Second World War, and there was ongoing debate until 2005, when the anniversary was falling, on the text of that resolution. And hard to believe, especially from the Polish perspective, but it took a major concerted effort of then Polish MEPs from different political families, together with their colleagues from the Baltic countries and some other Central European countries, to convince their own colleagues from different political families to actually distinguish in the text of the resolution between liberation of Western Europe by the Allies and its positive impact, and very, let's say, mixed results of Soviet reoccupation of territories in Eastern and Central Europe, and the political battle not to use in that context the word liberation. Thank you.
Okay, so we have mentioned the Enigma. I know that Claire has something else to add about the Enigma, which I will let you do in just a moment. So Poles did not only just contribute to the Battle of Britain, as we very well know, but throughout the war they contributed to, as I said, the Enigma Code, reporting the horrors taking place in Auschwitz and other camps, Battle of Monte Cassino, also the Polish Navy participated. Claire, can you elaborate a little bit more about this and the Polish involvement in the British intelligence service, specifically Christina Scarbeck's role, and how is she remembered today? Has her memory made it into the wider British narrative? And if not, why?
Okay, great. Well, it's quite a lot to look at there. So very briefly, little comment on Enigma. It's actually interesting, Roger was saying about the importance of films and popular culture in getting history getting people engaged, the wider public engaged in history. And I think one of the unfortunate things that people first heard about Enigma through the film of the Robert Harris book, and I think the film was particularly poor in that the way it depicted a Pole who was working there, which was completely fictional and I feel derogatory. But since then, I am very glad to say that, well, we had the Enigma film about Alan Turing. And I think in Britain, really, Enigma is almost synonymous with this British cryptanalyst. He's very much lionised in the UK. Now, next year, he'll be on the new £50 note in Britain. And I think you could almost stun people in Britain think that Alan Turing, broke the Enigma code on his own, which is a shame. But rather wonderfully, last year, Alan Turing's own nephew, Dermot Turing, wrote a book called X, Y and Z, which looks at the bigger story, which looks at what his subtitle is the real story of how Enigma was broken. And it talks about all of the Polish work, in the actual decoding the mathematical work, as well as bringing the machinery itself. And so we are beginning to see a bit more nuance in this story. And that name, Marian Rejewski, is beginning to be known a little bit more. So that is fantastic. And I just hope we can get another film based on that story, because that's a fantastic story, brilliantly told in that book, that could do with serialization or filmmaking in some way. Likewise, intelligence around things like Auschwitz. I'm very glad that last year Jack Fairweather's book, The Volunteer, which of course is based on Witold Pilecki's sort of memoir, The Auschwitz Volunteer, what was published and won the Costa National Book Prize. So again, we're beginning to get somewhere. It's a start anyhow, I put it that way. I think there's more to do. But moving on to my main sort of subject area, which is, of course, Christina Scarbeck. And I'm sure a number of people here, well, I hope a number of people may know her name, since my biography of her has been out for quite a few years now. So she was a Polish-born countess. She had a Jewish-born mother and a Catholic aristocratic father, and she was deeply patriotic. And she was actually on her way to with her husband, who was a diplomat, going to Africa when war broke out. But they immediately came back. It was too late for them to return to Poland, would have been pointless. And they came to London. Her husband went off, and I think he expected Christine to drink a few cocktails in London, but she wasn't going to sit the war out there. So within days, she has not so much volunteered, I think, as demanded to be taken on by the British Secret Intelligence Services. And of course, they didn't want to. For a start, you have to be British to work for the British Intelligence Services, so she's ruled out immediately. And of course, she's a woman as well. And there were no women in this role at this point. In fact, later they were partly taken on because of her achievements and her example of how much women could achieve. And then the main reason they were taken on, partly is why she was taken on, is because, not because women are glamorous or honey traps or whatever, but because women are overlooked and could move around more easily behind enemy lines without attracting attention. So Christina was, before Christmas of 1939, she was in Hungary, preparing to go on her first mission into occupied Poland, which she undertook in 1940. She spent some time there, both bringing in British propaganda, partly to counteract some of those German posters that were mentioned earlier, when one of the panelists described the first female casualty of the war was a postwoman who pulled one of those posters off the wall. Well, Christine was bringing in propaganda and information to counter some of that. She was also bringing in some money. She was bringing in to make communications with the resistance, and she was also doing her own investigations and reporting on troop movements and so on around the country and bringing that out again. So she did 3 very hazardous missions into Poland. She was arrested, talked her way out of trouble more than once. She ended up working in 3 different theatres of the war, and her final theatre was in 1944. She was dropped behind enemy lines in France, and that's where her most legendary achievements took place. Again, I could talk for hours, but just in brief, she made the first contact between the French resistance on one side of the Alps and the Italian partisans on the other side, trying to prepare the way for the largely American, but British and American forces that were coming in the south of France for D-Day in the south, which happened a few weeks after the more famous D-Day in the north. And she managed to secure the defection of an entire German garrison on the strategic Col de l'Arche pass in the Alps. And when a number of her male colleagues were arrested and scheduled for execution, she also single-handedly managed to rescue them. She's an extraordinary woman. So why is she not better known given all this? Well, I'm slightly disappointed. I mean, I'm pleased. My book was published. It's now come out in America, Poland, Hungary, Italy, China, and recently in Russia, though I haven't seen the cover of that one yet. That will be interesting to see how that goes down. Because one of her achievements was to smuggle microfilm taken by the Polish resistance group, the Musketeers, hidden inside her leather gloves. She took it across borders, and that showed the massing of German tanks and troops on what was then the German side of the German-Soviet border. So preparations for Operation Barbarossa, and that information went to Churchill's desk, for which he later told his daughter that Christina Scarbeck was his favourite spy. So it was optioned by Universal Studios. I got very excited about that, but unfortunately that's been COVID cancelled. So the rights are available. If we have any filmmakers there, please get in touch. But we have done some other fantastic things. So there is now a bronze bust of Christina Scarbeck at Ognisko, the Polish club, where anyone can see it in the members' room in London. And again, I do think we're beginning to make this part of the wider narrative. But again, I think there's much more to do. There were many other extraordinary women like Clementine Mankowska and Zoe Elżbieta Zawaka. There are so many of them, and I think there's an opportunity to tell more of those stories. But I have just got to say, well, I can't say it, but please, on Christina Scarbeck, do watch this space for a bit of news coming up tomorrow, which is pretty exciting in Britain as well. So I think we're beginning to get there.
Fantastic. You can catch Claire's Twitter if anybody's on Twitter. The announcement will be made tomorrow. It's, from what I hear, very exciting news. So, and congratulations for the news that's going to come along. Would anybody like to add anything? we can move on. This one's going to be aimed at Pavel because we haven't actually mentioned the role that the radio played during the Second World War, which is the BBC. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
It was absolutely crucial. BBC turned out to be probably the most important source of information for Poles, despite the fact that it was forbidden to keep a radio receiver in Poland, and there was the death penalty for that. But dozens of thousands of Poles listened to the British radio. There was also a Polish radio, Polskie Radio, broadcasting on the British frequencies. So it was an absolutely crucial source of information, not only about the developments on the front, but also in Poland, because the information collected by the Polish underground state was brought back to England and to the Polish government in exile, and very often broadcast by BBC and by the Polish radio from London. And interestingly enough, this prestige and position and credibility created by BBC during the war continued after the war, and Poles under the communism listened to BBC, and in the first years after the war it was the most popular Western station, broadcasting station, until Radio Free Europe was created in the 1950s, and BBC had to compete with Radio Free Europe and with Voice of America, created by the Americans. But I think it's often overlooked how important BBC was for Poles and also for other occupied nations in Europe.
It was important during the Warsaw Uprising as well, wasn't it?
Well, it was important throughout the whole occupation, and at the very beginning of the occupation, many underground organizations which were created from below as grassroots initiatives, were often people from these organizations listened to BBC and wrote down the most important news and made some leaflets, of course, secretly, and they were distributed among those people who didn't have radio. So not only the Warsaw Uprising, but throughout the whole occupation and even afterwards.
Would anybody like to add anything? Okay, I think we should move on and let's start talking about Poland and Britain post-war. So the peace conferences, particularly Yalta, are seen by some Poles and in some historical narratives as a moment in which Britain betrayed Poland and sold her off to the Soviets. Let's start with Claire. First of all, do you agree with this narrative, and what are the different British versus Polish perspectives?
Okay, this is obviously a very sensitive and quite a difficult subject area. I mean, I absolutely see why so many Poles would feel let down, abandoned and betrayed by the agreements at Yalta, completely so. British and Polish soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder in so many theatres of the war, at Monte Cassino, Tobruk, Battle of Britain, of course, and yet when it came to the liberation of Poland and the interests of Poland, where were their allies? From the British perspective, and I think it's very important that we look at all sides, I think Yalta is happening in February 1945. By then, we're in the end game of the Second World War. Roosevelt's thinking is obviously very much already moved on to Japan, how to end the war in the Pacific. The Red Army is already in Poland. Britain's economy is very weak at this point. We're getting Polish American loans, of course. And at this point, the liberation of Poland would have required not only US funds, but US forces as well, American forces. This means that Roosevelt, he would have required the support of the American people and their representatives in the US Congress. And can you imagine Roosevelt in February 1945 asking Senate and the House of Representatives to vote through the money that was needed? There is no way at all at this point. Especially, Russia is America's ally at this point. And remember, how hard it was to get America into the war in the first place. To now get them to commit to fund a war against a country that is officially their ally in Eastern Europe, it was not going to happen. So I guess, Yalta is seen as the moment when Roosevelt and Churchill, America and Britain, handed over half of Europe to Stalin. But I really think, in reality, that this new map of Europe wasn't really decided at the conference tables there. I think it had already been decided in the forests of Katyn and on battlefields across Europe over the previous 5 years. There had already been this Soviet land grab, which was, the result of the German defeat. And the Soviets already controlled Poland and much of the Balkans. So Yalta put the official seal on that. And of course, there was no Polish representation, there was no French representation there. And there was a degree of, there was a betrayal there. But I would argue that the work had already taken place on the battlefield and that at this point, it was an impossible position. But I'd also very much like to hear my Polish colleague perspectives.
I can see Pavel would like to say something.
Yes, the Polish memory of Yalta is very traumatic. This is regarded as a betrayal by the United States and by the Great Britain. And this narrative is very persistent. It continues until nowadays, and this is perceived as a dual betrayal. The first betrayal regarding the Polish territory, because finally the eastern half of Poland was conceded to the Soviet Union. And the second one was even perhaps worse, because both Washington and London agreed to withdraw the recognition from the Polish legal government in London and to recognize shortly the Stalin-created government. Interestingly enough, the Polish politicians and the Polish public opinion didn't know at that moment, which is obvious, but even now don't pay too much attention to the fact that Churchill was this politician who was much more determined than Roosevelt in defending the Polish interests. For example, Churchill tried to convince Stalin that Lviv should be kept within the Polish borders. And also Churchill wanted to have such a provision that the election that was planned to be held in Poland should have international guarantees. So there would be a chance that it would be a free election. And it was because of Roosevelt, who didn't want to support Churchill, that Stalin basically got all what he wanted in Yalta. But these are perhaps details relevant for historians, but not for the Polish public opinion. As a historian, I am less radical in seeing Yalta as the betrayal, as I agree with Claire that at that moment, almost whole Poland was already taken over by the Red Army, and it simply was a realpolitik. Stalin did not want to retreat the Red Army from Poland. I would add one point of view that perhaps is less known. Churchill had two good ideas that perhaps could have changed the fate of war. Perhaps not, but there was a slight chance to do it. First, in 1943, he had an idea that the Allies should organize the invasion not of France, but of the Balkans. And from the Balkans, there was also a slight chance that the British and Americans would reach Central Europe, would reach Poland earlier than before the Red Army. It was rejected mostly by the military as not feasible in military terms, but also for political reasons, because Stalin did not want to agree. But there was also another idea of Churchill, which is less known. In 1945, in spring 1945, the American and the British troops, they managed to occupy bigger portions of Germany than was agreed in Tehran and Yalta. And Churchill had such an idea that the Americans and the Brits should keep their positions until the free elections are organized in Poland. It was rejected by Roosevelt and by Eisenhower as not feasible. They didn't want to jeopardize the alliance with the Soviet Union. But these ideas were probably the only ways to try to somehow alleviate the Polish situation. It's not certain that it really would help, but Churchill probably felt somehow morally obliged to the Poles, but also politically he was much more aware of real Soviet intentions than Roosevelt. So it was a combination, in my opinion, of a moral obligation towards the Poles and of a realpolitik as it was understood by Churchill, but unfortunately it was not shared by Roosevelt, which was the commander-in-chief and the president of a much more powerful state than Great Britain at that moment.
Would anyone else like to add anything to what Pavel said? Roger?
If you don't, yes, I will. I agree with all of that. That was excellent exposition and a nice mention of the Ljubljana Gap there from Pavel. There's a wonderful phrase that Halek Kochanski uses in her book, where she talks about Poland as the uncomfortable ally, the inconvenient ally, which I think is rather useful, because certainly from the middle of the war on, I suppose by the latest point, by the discovery of the Katyn forest graves in the spring of 1943, Poland becomes effectively an potential obstacle to the smooth running of the Grand Alliance. And the smooth running of the Grand Alliance, of course, is the most crucial grand strategic idea going at the time. You had to keep the Soviets on board. You had to keep them fighting. Bear in mind, of course, that 4 out of 5 German soldiers die on the Eastern Front at Soviet hands, so they are bearing the brunt of the fighting during World War II. This idea of keeping the Grand Alliance running smoothly rather trumps any other political, sentimental, strategic concern going. So unfortunately, Poland does fall by the wayside into that to a large extent at that point, and that's where it becomes that inconvenient ally to the British. But as we've just heard, it's heartening to hear how, to some extent, still concern for Poland did at least try to motivate British actions. On that point, you have to go back again to 1939. 1939, the British, of course, signed their military agreement promising to help Poland, then effectively do nothing. Then that commitment to Poland is essentially morphed into a commitment to restore Poland at some future date after the victory against Nazi Germany had been secured. And then, of course, that commitment also falls by the wayside at Yalta. So there are sort of two betrayals. It's a double betrayal, effectively. And I don't think betrayal is too much of a hard word here, but you have to understand why that happens. In both cases, it's effectively the intrusion of a rather brutal realpolitik over those more everyday concerns.
Maybe as a last word, it should be mentioned that actually Yalta was just like signing off of a deal that was really made in Tehran, exactly at the I would say climax moment of the Second War, when what Roger described as basically a smooth running of the Grand Alliance became absolutely paramount. That was the last moment when the Germans and the Soviets were conducting diplomatic talks on possibility of unilateral peace settlement between Germans and Soviets. So the Americans and the British, they wanted to make sure that there will be unconditional surrender of Germany to the whole of the Grand Alliance.
Okay, Pavel, we're coming back to the Polish government in exile. Were they a source of hope for Poles living in communist Poland, or rather were they seen as being detached from the reality of Polish experience behind the Iron Curtain?
Well, I think that throughout the decades under the communist regime, most Poles did not have a very precise knowledge about the Polish government in exile that continued to work in London. It was a rather more vague knowledge that the Polish political emigres stayed in the West and they struggled for the Polish independence. And very soon there was a sort of decomposition of the unity of the Polish, exile community. There were many groups, even in London, competing for power. So there was the government in exile, but there was the political council, later the Council of the National Unity. And very soon, Radio Free Europe was created by the Americans. That was the most influential tool of reaching the Polish public behind the Iron Curtain. But interestingly enough, many authors that contributed to the Radio Free Europe broadcasting lived in London or in Great Britain. These were intellectuals, politicians. So there was a sort of a symbiosis between various groups of the Polish immigration. A very important monthly for intellectuals was Kultura, published in Paris. But interestingly enough, the leading publicist, political publicist of Kultura was Juliusz Mieroszewski, living in London. So I would say that it was not only about the Polish government in exile, it was more about a very diverse Polish exile community that was really a very vibrant environment politically and culturally, and it existed both in the UK and in the United States and in Germany. But legally speaking, the government in exile continued to work, to function in London, although it was not recognized by the majority of world states. But in terms of symbols and the legal continuity, it was important, I think, for the Polish nation, for the Polish state, that this legal continuation existed and it was preserved until the fall of the communism, and it was somehow transmitted to the independent Polish state after the collapse of the communism.
Would anybody like to add anything? Okay, just a reminder, everybody, we're going to be nearing the end soon. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box and please put your name in front so we know who we're talking to. I'm going to put this one out to all the panelists. It's quite a bit of a long one, so please do bear with me. So we're talking about Poles in the UK, and there've been there is a very large community of Poles there. And there have been very many different waves of immigration, some who have found themselves in the UK from political exiles to more recently economic migrants. Do you think that the presence of a growing number of Poles in the UK has ignited more of an interest in the Polish contribution to British history? And what aspects of Polish contribution to war and post-war British history is still underrepresented? Sorry, apologies there. I know we've discussed a little bit of this already, but I would like people to take this just a little bit further for us. So who would like to go first to answer the question? I think Roger.
Oh, fair enough. Yeah, I think that's, it's interesting how there is a degree of growing interest. I don't know if that's just me sort of from my own bubble projecting it outwards, but I think there is a growing interest in Polish history. And it comes to some extent, I think, from not necessarily, the Polish minorities here in Britain themselves, but probably from their neighbours and their friends who are then sort of alerted to, another narrative in their midst. So I think it has a sort of a knock-on effect, not necessarily a direct one, but an indirect one. But these things are sort of slowly growing, and it's amazing. I mean, I found from my own experience, amazing how many of the older generation of diaspora Poles, how many there were, and how they were so thoroughly assimilated in many cases, not in all, of course. You've got very many who kept their identity and speak fluent Polish and all the rest of it. But there are many that I'd sort of met who you'd find, had no contact to Poland, had no Polish, had no knowledge of Polish history, had never been to Poland. and yet they were called, had a Polish surname. So there's quite a lot of those people that perhaps now are rediscovering an interest in Polish history that maybe wasn't there before. As we know, Polish history is an interest that tends to come with age rather than age and experience rather than youth. So I think there is a growing interest in this stuff. Against that argument, we have to understand that I think every nation has more or less a parochial view of its own history. Nobody has this sort of perfect, all-encompassing ecumenical view of history. It just doesn't really exist. So we all tend to concentrate on our own contributions rather than necessarily, incorporating other people's. But so I think this is something that we do have to bear in mind, that we all tend to concentrate on the parochial over the universal. One question in here talks about, what aspect of Polish history do you think is underrepresented? The one that always strikes me, which is one of the most fascinating and one of the, richest, both in terms of its history and its emotional resonance, is the whole Polish odyssey of those Poles deported from Eastern Poland, Siberia, amnesty in inverted commas, Anders army, and ending up in Palestine, Monte Cassino. That whole odyssey is the only word for it, is one that when I tell that story, even in the most brief terms, to British friends of mine, their mouths tend to fall open, and this is something they've never heard before, and it's a spectacular story, and it's one that really, really deserves to be much better known in Britain. And I would say that would be the one, if I was to choose one subject that needs better recognition and better, spreading of knowledge in the UK, I would say it's that one. What can be done better? As I said before, I think, there's always a role for sort of serious history, university history to play, but unfortunately academic history in the UK seems to be obsessed with, lost in its culture wars at the moment, so we can't expect too much progress on that front. Most people tend to get their history from television and from popular history rather than academic history. So we just need TV makers and popular historians to be a bit braver with their choices, to not write yet another book about the dam busters D-Day, because there are thousands of those and we don't need any more, but to actually jump in and write about Anders and write about something much more interesting and much more exotic. So let's embrace that Polish history, I would say.
Roger, I have taken your advice on board. Thank you. So Claire has a comment to make. Go for it, Claire. And you're muted. You need to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Hopefully I'm there. This year, I was invited to write introductions to 3 different, very small books. Well, not this year, over the last couple of years. One was for the Warsaw Uprising Museum, which was a fantastic graphic novel, which I did a little piece introduction for. And then there was one for the Pilsudski Institute. So that's in Britain, but again, within the community, which was about 4 women who's had very different experiences. One drove a support vehicle at Monte Cassino. One was on that epic journey that Roger's just been talking about, and so on. So there is growing interest there. But the latest one was by a British publisher, and it was just to do the introduction to a new book on a lady called Lily Pullman, who had an extraordinary life, and that was being published by Holland House Books. So just on that trajectory, we've gone from a Polish publisher in Poland to a Polish publisher in Britain to a British publisher in Britain. So slowly we seem to be getting there. Having said that, I've got 2 more things to say just quickly. I have been submitting to publishers the idea I've had for another book which touches very much on the Polish history, very central to that, and it's been rejected by all of them so far, which is very disappointing, and I'm just going to keep that battle up. What they want me to do is do the same book I've done, another female heroine, and actually I want to do something slightly different. So it is still an uphill battle. However, I am going to get there, obviously, hopefully. But the other thing I want to say is that there are different ways of looking at this. And I just wanted to highlight a fantastic project in Northern Ireland called For Your Freedom of Ours, which is a further education community project run by a man called Machcewicz in that community organisation. And it's doing brilliant work because obviously there is a very specific Polish diaspora in Northern Ireland as well because of the military history there. And there had been quite a lot of anti-Polish. It's already a very divided community in Northern Ireland, of course, and there were various different religious and so on tensions in play here. So it's a very complicated situation. But there had been some violence and intimidation against the Polish community. And the work there that community project has done with a lot of outreach work has been fantastic and really helped to turn that around, so that now we have Polish flags flying in above certain town halls in Northern Ireland, and we even have murals of 303 Squadron painted on the walls in Northern Ireland, which is one of the big cultural things they do there, the painting of murals on external walls. So this is another way. There are different ways that this work can be done.
Fantastic. We're just going to top off with our last question, and this one is for Przemyslaw, and this is exactly what he works on at PISM. So do tell us, do you think that Brexit is a new turning point in bilateral relations?
Yeah, actually, I think it is for a few different reasons. First of all, we have to realize that in numerical terms, majority of the Polish community in Britain is relatively recent and is connected mostly to the Polish membership to the European Union. We have observed huge waves of economic migration in 2004, 2005, 2006, 2007. Those people, they are actually the first wave of Polish migrants wherever, if I may say so, in the Polish history, who are living in the conditions that they are able, thanks to technology, but also political changes. They are not political migrants. They are not escaping from Poland due to persecution by occupying powers or by communist authorities. And they are able to stay in touch in quite effective and vivid way with the old country. And that's extremely important. And this community will be there for another 30, 40, 50 years, and hopefully will strengthen this kind of hunger for better knowledge of Polish history within the British society that has been eloquently discussed by Clare and by Roger. But there is an additional dimension to that. Under the present conditions, Polish passport is becoming quite attractive. So we might see quite an interest in obtaining Polish passport as an EU passport with all connected social and mobility rights within the EU, by people who may rediscover the Polish roots, not just those recent migrants, because basically all of them, they hold Polish passports. Furthermore, Brexit is also a kind of chance to build more, I would say, more equal partnership between Poland and the EU. Poland in this relationship will be leveraged by its membership. Britain won't be. And let me end with the kind of final note that I do hope that Britain in foreseeable future will stick to those promises that were expressed by many British politicians, that Britain has left the EU, but it's not leaving Europe, that we will still have good cooperation between our countries in terms of, for example, defense and security, that there still will be British soldiers coming to Poland to be stationed here as part of NATO. But also there will be continued this collaborative effort that, for example, Polish and British troops have in Estonia with colleagues from other countries in protecting free world there, if I may say so. In other words, Brexit has redefined for foreseeable future Polish-British relations, but hopefully this kind of redefinition, it will bring also some positive results. Thank you.
Roger, did you want to add anything into there?
Sorry, I think you. Yeah, I had to unmute myself. Sorry. Yeah, I agree entirely. I think Brexit, in this sense, should be an opportunity. My first thought when talking about, whether this is a turning point, my fervent hope would be it would make no difference to Poles living in the UK, or as little difference as possible. Britain is not geographically leaving Europe. It's still there, moored off the northwest coast of the continent, and we will need to rebuild those relationships and build those bilateral relationships. And obviously, having that Polish minority in Britain is a good starting point for building those bilateral relationships. So, I think this is advantageous actually to have that Polish connection already made, and Poland could, going forward, could be one of our best sort of trading partners. So. I don't see this in negative terms necessarily, as I think some people might do. I would hope that this can be a very positive thing.
Maybe as a last note, I will do some shameless self-promotion on the part of my employers. I just wanted to say that in 2017 there has been created a new forum for intersocietal cooperation, which is known as the Polish-British Belvedere Forum. And I'm quite proud to say that the last edition, which was in March last year, just before lockdowns in both countries, it was the first edition that was organized by my institution and the Royal Institute of International Affairs. It took place in London. And I'm very happy to say that we have already been working on the new edition, which will be coming most probably in March next year. Thank you.
I just want to say thank you so much to our panelists for this absolutely brilliant and insightful discussion. We have a couple of minutes for some questions from our audience. I just want to give everybody a reminder to please put your questions in the chat box with your name. I've got the first one here, which is from David Jones. It's for Roger. First of all, there's two questions. How come there aren't any more books of Roger Moorhouse on Audible? And number two, can he get an autograph, please?
Right, Audible. Yeah, more a question for my agent actually as to why more books aren't on Audible. They tend to like sort of ultra modern, what's just coming out now, rather than going through the back catalogue. So the short answer to that one is that's really a question for Audible and for my agent, unfortunately, rather than me. How I go about signing an Audible copy of a book, I'm not sure, but I'm happy to. If you want to drop me an email, I'm happy to send a sort of a signed card or something like that. So absolutely.
Okay, bear with me just one moment. I'm scrolling through a few questions. Sorry, apologies, a few more technical difficulties. Okay, so this one is from Anita. I would be interested to hear the panelists' opinion on how painful moments between Poland and the UK, for example, the lack of recognition of Polish pilots, the trauma perceived betrayal at Yalta's, impact on present relationships between the two countries. Do these betrayals colour present interactions between the countries politically and or culturally? Who would like to have a stab at that one first?
That's interesting. I think from a British perspective, I know that these are all topics that sort of burn very brightly in the Polish consciousness, and often get sort of brought up in conversation with Brits like myself. But I have to say, from a British perspective, this stuff doesn't really feature. And that's not sort of being callous or cruel about it, but that's our understanding of the world war the narrative of the World War, as I said before, is rather parochial. We know sort of intimate detail of D-Day and the Dam Busters raid, and know nothing about the odyssey of many thousands of Poles to Siberia and elsewhere. So that gives you an idea of where our sort of perspectives and our prejudices lie. So these aspects that you talk about, you know, the trauma of Yalta and the shame of the victory parade in '46 that Claire mentioned, they really, unfortunately, they don't really feature, I wouldn't say, in our domestic sort of perception of the narrative of the war. Perhaps they should. Perhaps there's a couple of stages on, once we've educated people on, you know, those other more crucial elements of you know, the Polish contribution. Maybe we'll get to that stuff, but at the moment, I don't think it's there.
Anybody else would like to add anything? Okay, we have another question from Katarzyna Szyszka. In the light of history of Polish-British relations, what do you think the relationship will be after Brexit? I think, Przemyslaw, that one's for you.
Well, we'll see. Actually, quite a lot of depends on the final stages, final steps of the process, and as probably everybody knows, there is some considerable tension at the moment connected to the reinterpretation by the British government of the withdrawal agreement. But optimistically assuming that this story will finish well, I think actually Poland will remain one of the countries within the EU that will be very open to cooperation with Britain. I think that, at least from the Polish point of view, Polish-British relations are much wide. They are based on the much broader scope than just economy. The Polish community at the moment makes them very strong in social sense, but the relation between the two countries is also very strong in security terms, and in foreseeable future it will remain so. From analyzing, let's say, the British standpoint, I can also imagine that there will be undertakings to keep a kind of special close relationships with at least some big countries that are connected to Britain both economically and in security terms, and that share at least some of the outlook of the world. And I would say Poland meets all those conditions. How this will play exactly, it's obviously too early to say. But I think there are all the conditions for a new kind of partnership between Poland and Britain after Brexit.
We've got another question from Roger Moorhouse. It's a bit of a long one, so do bear with me. Does the panel think that the failure of pre-war British diplomacy resulting in only Poland being an ally without a favoured entity of USSR, Romania and Turkey, leading to an impossible military position in 1939, and also that Poland was the only ally not to be liberated by the Western Allies in 1945, tended to the British during and since the war to blind spot the Polish contribution to victory up till this day due to embarrassment and impotence rather than contempt or disregard. Who would like to take a stab at that one first?
I'll just, that sort of sounds like it's one for me, not least because we're probably related. I'm not sure if Alan's a relative, but he might be. I think it's quite an interesting one that, you know, whether this disregard, you see this in the narrative of 1939, for example, this idea that it was sort of to some extent shame or embarrassment on behalf of Britain that, you know, that they failed the Poles in 39, and then of course, as he said, they failed the Poles again in 45. That this is at heart the reason why we have this blind spot about Polish history. I can see why you might make that connection, but I don't think it's that calculated, if I'm honest. I think there is just a blind spot about Polish history. It's a combination of a number of factors. I mean, not least to sort of paraphrase Chamberlain, it's the idea of a faraway country of which we know little. That was, I think, for much of the 20th century, that was the viewpoint, not least when it's behind the Iron Curtain, where it's almost forbidden to know anything about that country. So that was one problem. And certainly in terms of 1939, then nobody was sort of talking about 1939 in honest terms, even after the war. I mean, the Germans went on to, commit greater atrocities, so they had greater things to expiate than 1939 necessarily. The Soviets, of course, pretended they weren't there, so it was never part of their narrative. And the British and the French also had bigger things to talk about. They were a bit too busy talking about, D-Day and Dunkirk. So, I don't see it as quite as sort of conscious omission as Alan's question suggests it is. I think it's just that, unfortunately, Polish history has fallen through the cracks traditionally, and to a large extent continues to fall through the cracks, which is very regrettable. Again, another point, I mentioned academia before, but just briefly, we have, I think there are 4 universities in the UK that have departments of Polish studies, which is pretty pathetic when you bear in mind how many departments of German studies there are. So this is something that, we probably need to change in this country, just to sort of, bring it up to, some sort of vaguely comparable level would be good. But that's a product of, Poland not being on the map for 123 years. It's a product of the Cold War. It's a product of geographical distance. So there's all of that to catch up on. But again, go back to the question, I don't see this necessarily as a conscious sort of disregarding of Polish history. It's just unfortunately how it is.
Pavel, you have a comment to make?
A very short comment. I fully agree with Roger that perhaps this is a sort of a bad conscience, but probably more lack of knowledge, which was the result of separation of Europe during the Cold War and the ignorance about the fate of those nations that were left on the other side of the Iron Curtain. And the proof for this argument is that this is not only the question of Great Britain, but of all other West European countries whose, populations, besides, the narrow circles of academics, experts, don't know almost anything about how the war looked like in Poland, but also, more generally in Eastern Europe. So this is the legacy of, I would say, the Cold War, and we have a lot of work to do somehow to introduce our Polish and our Central European historical experience into the dominant narratives of the war that had been shaped during the Cold War in the West mostly. And this is why several years ago I put forward an idea that we should create in Poland the Museum of the Second World War, which would somehow help connecting Polish and East European war experience and West European war experience. And this museum is still there in Gdańsk. It was opened 3 years ago. So this is another attempt somehow to present the Polish war experience to the West and to the Brits as well, of course.
Amazing. I want to thank everyone so much for this. We've now reached the end of our event. I do want to apologise. I know we had more questions, but if you do want to get Roger and Claire and Przemyslaw, not so much Pavel on Twitter, but you can contact them if you've got any more questions. Like I do, just send a tweet. I want to again thank the British Embassy, Chevening for sponsoring the event, and the British Alumni Society for spreading the word to their alumni network. Also, not to forget our incredible and knowledgeable panelists. And of course, last of all, Maria Świderska, thank you so much for putting all of this together. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.